Hello, everyone. Books with Banks back again today, and I'm so grateful to be joined by Johanna from Johanna Reads. That's the channel, right?
That's the
um,
handle. Yeah, I've always just gone by Joanna, but ever since YouTube started requiring us to have handles,
yeah, yeah.
I just went with the easy thing, Joanna Reads, because I'm just not that creative. But yeah, that's my channel name.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on my channel today to have this discussion. You were one of the a few years ago. There was a lot of Malazan content coming out. So like Jimmy Nuts and you were both reading Malazan for the first time, and Philip and AP, they were doing their kind of reread discussions. And so anytime any of you had a video come out or a conversation about the series, I was always so excited to see what the new takes were and what everyone's experience was like. So it's just wonderful to have you on here to talk about. I was hoping we could talk about, just booktube in general, your experience on the platform. Um, Maybe even if there's anything strange or frustrating about YouTube for you, or just what it's been like, series you've read, certain projects you're working on now. Does that all that sound good? Or
Yeah, sounds great. And I just wanted to thank you so much for having me because I've been really excited to have a conversation with you because I know you're much further along than me on your Malazan journey, having read a lot of the ice books, for example. So I would be curious to hear your experience too with that and with your booktube channel as well.
okay. Thank you. I guess for kind of maybe just a jumping off point question, I'm curious when you started your channel. Was there one particular thing that motivated you to start? A book you read, anything like that? Maybe like what date and month, or like when exactly did it start? And
Yes.
yeah.
Mhm. Sure. Yeah. So I started my channel in 2021. It was in January at the very beginning of the month. And I started my channel. The story is it was kind of a joke. So what happened was I had watched BookTube for several years before starting a channel. And when I found BookTube, mostly what I had found due to algorithm stuff, I guess, whatever was popping up on YouTube that was popular at the time was a lot of YA fantasy. And I enjoyed that. I had taken a long break from reading fiction at all. And so getting back into fantasy, I thought it was kind of fun to get into YA fantasy, but I quickly started to want to dive into deeper stuff. And at the time, I remember finding YouTube to skew a little young. I thought booktube was more female dominated and more YA fantasy dominated, but of course that was just the content I was finding at the time. And then when I one day actually I was following a content creator I really liked, and she shouted out my dear friend, who's now my dear friend, Alan from the Library of Alexandria. And as soon as I found Alan's channel, I was hooked. I just went and binged all his past videos, which I never do when I find a channel, but I did for his because I thought he was so funny, so entertaining, and I just enjoyed his content. And at that point in my booktube journey, or in my reading journey, I should say, I had already started Malazan. I had read at least the first two books. And so it was a joy to find Alan's channel because he also had reviewed the first two books in Malazan. But what happened was after I found Alan's channel, I started interacting with him. And around the same time, I found Philip Chase's channel. And so I think that the YouTube algorithm started to figure out, oh, this person likes adult fantasy and actually enjoys older content creators that are, at least 30 plus. Nothing against younger than that, by the way.
Right.
I love all ages. I'm not an ageist person. It just was nice to see different representation in the book sphere and to see different types of genres represented, including adult fantasy. So I started getting into it that way. And then I started commenting on Alan's videos, which I never did before. I just always was a lurker on BookTube and was surprised just how kind and down to earth, interactive he was. And it started to make me feel more encouraged to go ahead and start commenting on people's videos, which I never thought I could do. I never thought people would actually respond to any comment I had to say. And so that was how I got to start to become friends with a lot of these people, including Philip and Alan. and various people in the Discord community. So I joined Discord thanks to Alan, met a whole bunch of other people through that platform. And it was there that I one day looked on my YouTube, because everybody has like a YouTube section, even if they don't have a channel. And I noticed that I had 5 subscribers, and I thought that was hilarious because I didn't have any content. So I thought, haha, I have 5 subscribers. And maybe it was even less than that, actually, now that I think about it. Maybe it was 3 subscribers, but I got a kick out of it. And I said, if I make it to the milestone of 5 subscribers, maybe that's what it was. I said, I'll go ahead and do a Q&A video.
I know.
And I just meant it as kind of a joke, but then people like my friends in Discord subscribed, and then they sent me, and I said, okay, well, what are your questions? I'll just make a funny video of me answering some questions, and I'll probably delete it, but we'll see how it goes. So that's how I started, and I did the Q&A video, and I was just surprised how many people commented and were so nice, and it was just kind of fun to put the video together. Just various factors. And so that was what got me started on the journey into booktube.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Sure.
I'm curious, have you seen a lot of change since early 2021 to now as far as like popular trends, or I guess popular trends specific to the like more adult fantasy, epic fantasy kind of side of things? Yeah, just kind of curious if what's different about it now than it was a few years ago.
That's a really good question. It's kind of challenging because I feel like even then I wasn't exposed to as many channels that focused on adult fantasy or epic
Okay.
fantasy. But I've started, of course, now I am subscribed to many channels that focus on that genre. And I don't know, I guess it's hard to say because booktube is so huge.
Right,
I mean, there are
right.
probably millions of booktube channels, right? And so like the place of booktube where I hang out is probably a very, very, very tiny little corner. Like we all know each other, right? But we're a tiny little corner of the internet. We're a tiny little corner of booktube. And I don't think we're necessarily representative of all epic fantasy readers or, of all of booktube. But I guess in the tiny corner where I hang out, various things. I know the standard format of booktube seems to be prevalent, which are TBRs and wrap-ups. Those are the biggest thing. People complain that reviews don't get a lot of traction, and that's probably true. So I guess you see a little bit less of that these days. And you see a lot of recommendation videos because any video where you have multiple books mentioned, I think is going to draw some focus and some
Right.
attention. It seems like in this tiny corner that I'm in, the people who are really into the algorithm, chasing the algorithm, trying to gain a bigger platform, it seems like things that they tend to do are usually hot takes, or doing the big popular trend on booktube last year. And it's not just in booktube, I've seen it in other parts of YouTube, are these collaborative videos where it's like what my favorite booktuber's book of 2023 or,
Right.
or this is the best book I've read or the worst book I've read. Some people know how to use those kind of titles in their thumbnails to draw attention. So I
Right.
would say that I don't know that a lot has changed. I know people are talking a lot about book talk having an influence and reels and shorts. So I guess that's all fairly new. At the same time, I still feel, at least for my personal channel and what I've noticed on other people I follow, is that I don't think these long form discussions like we're having here are necessarily going away. I feel like there's still a place for them. I know my audience, whatever niche audience that is, they tend to love my long form discussions with other booktubers. And I happen to enjoy that kind of content the most. So I'm thrilled to see that's the case.
Yeah. Have you tried your hand at any book talk stuff or okay. I wasn't sure, but
Yeah, no, I haven't personally. What about you? And when did you start your channel, by the way?
so I started maybe like the last week of September or first week of October, just last October, like last fall, 2022. And it was all because I read, or I had kind of finally caught up in what was published in the Malazan other series, and Erickson's second prequel book, Fall of Light, was the one that I had been waiting on for a while to get to. And I read that, and I went to YouTube, and I saw like a couple reviews, one of which by Philip Chase, and a couple discussion videos. But I just thought, oh, this book was it made me think so many things, and I have to talk about them, or I have to get some kind of conversation going about them. So that's why I started my channel. And now I'm not sure if the YouTube algorithm really knows what to do with me, because while I talk a lot about even the more niche kind of series connected to the Malazan world, I also talk about like A Court of Thorns and Roses and Outlander. So I think YouTube's a little bit confused about what my channel's all about. But
I've
yeah,
been
so
wanting, yeah, I've been wanting to ask you about that too, because I did notice that in some of your videos that you like, I guess what's called romantasy these days.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually I just filmed or recorded earlier today a video all about how when I started, I never thought that I would make videos about romance and that type of story. But then, or especially because I was reading a lot of Malazan, and if people have harsher critiques of Malazan, I've often seen people say, "Oh, unfortunately, a lot of the amorous kind of connections happen off page," or like we catch up to them much later after the characters are already in love. And yeah, which isn't anything that really ever bothered me about Malazan. But because I was focused on Erickson and Esselman's books, I thought, okay, well, I probably won't be talking that much about romance until I kind of look back at what I had been reading and thought, wow, it actually has been a lot of romance. So I should bring this up, because I'm sure this affects how I read things and how I yeah 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 and again, I'm not sure how the YouTube algorithm is going to take that, because I doubt people who are reading A Court of Thorns and Roses or Sarah J. Maas's stuff there's a lot of Venn diagram crossover with them reading Steven Erickson's Carcanas prequels. But who knows?
It's out there though. It
Yeah.
is out there. I know Brittany from Books with Brittany, and she's
Mhm.
a big fan of Sarah J. Maas and
Okay, okay.
that series, and a fan of Malazan, had a lot of Malazan content.
Right,
So
right.
you see a bridge, but I really love, because I think I've heard you mention this before. Like I appreciate that you're a male booktuber who enjoys romance. I feel like
Right.
there's a stigma. Am I
Yeah,
wrong?
oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I think so. And I think yeah, I spoke in what I recorded earlier today. I kind of spoke a little about just introducing the idea of romance in storytelling and sex scenes in storytelling. I spoke a little bit about how it's strange how people seem to be more annoyed or consider it like cringy, like the same innuendos get used over and over again with a lot of sex scenes in books. People find that more annoying or cringy than say a battle scene. And
Mhm.
there's only so many ways to write a battle scene. There's only so many ways to write a sex scene. And I think in a lot of ways they have a similar cathartic kind of, you build to this climactic moment where maybe a lot's being communicated, whether violently or romantically, that kind of just the tension and the scenes have been building up towards. And so I just kind of spoke a little bit about how I think it's interesting that the violent scene is people don't really seem to bat an eye at, and they don't necessarily seem bothered as much as the romantic scene. Yeah, yeah. And I think yeah, I'd have to credit Diana Gabaldon and Outlander as the main thing, that the main series that got me to think about it got me to think maybe just a little bit more deeply about a sex scene in a book, more than just, oh, haha, there. We got to the scene finally. We've been waiting for it. We knew it was going to happen. But I think there's a lot more that's being kind of creatively accomplished in those scenes than some readers give authors credit for. Now, don't get me wrong. I think there are some authors who just, write a scene just for the pure thrill of it, which is fine. And yeah, but have you read a ton of romance or?
Not a ton, but
Okay.
I've read a tiny bit of
Okay.
romance, and I'm all for romance. I think the challenge with romance is, um, so you mentioned battle scenes in romance. I think that
Yeah.
that's an interesting topic we could talk about here for a second. I think the thing with romance is that I am very particular about it. I'm very particular about it. I think for me personally as a reader, it can easily go into being a little cringeworthy if it's
Yeah.
not set up right.
Yeah.
And yet it can also add so much dimension to a story. Um, I also feel fairly similarly about battle scenes. Like,
Okay.
I love a good cinematic battle scene, but not to say that battle scenes can make me cringe. It's not the same reaction, but I found some battle scenes just boring
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
monotonous when they're trying to be so shocking, you know?
Yeah.
And so I think the challenge or the risk involved in writing a bad battle scene is much lower than writing a bad sex scene. It's, I
Yeah.
think, a much bigger risk to possibly make your audience cringe and think, oh my gosh, you think that's sexy? Because that's kind of intimate. You're revealing something
Right. Right.
intimate about yourself and what turns you on as a writer. Whereas
Right.
if you just write a boring battle scene, like, what is that going to mean about you? Like, I didn't like the way you just talked about blood, guts, and gore. It's probably going to roll off your shoulders a little bit easier, I would imagine.
Yeah.
So I think that that's also why readers tend to feel more comfortable with battle. Plus, as a reader, I also think it's very similar too. If you enjoy, let's say you're reading A Court of Thorns and Roses, and you really enjoy a sex scene in that book, and other people read it and think, oh, that's so disgusting. That's so
Right.
cringeworthy. Like, that didn't need to be in the book. I never am one of the people who says that, but some people say that. And in that case, what are they saying about you that you liked it?
Right.
So I
Right.
think there's a bit much, there's more of a bias, there are deeper stakes involved. There's a deeper risk of judgment and what that means about a person, whether it's the reader or the author, when it comes to sex scenes versus battle scenes.
Right. And I think yeah, that reminds me of how I think with a love scene in a book, authors run the risk of I don't know how to phrase this. I guess not all authors are as trauma informed or as aware of issues with sexual harassment and even sexual assault, where sometimes if an author's writing what they might consider just a more like risque scene, something maybe a more intense love scene, some readers, or they're running the risk of then having readers who have had particularly kind of traumatic experiences that might be really close to what they've just written. And if the story is presenting that scene in an exciting, positive way, obviously that's going to be very upsetting for a lot of readers. So I think that's definitely an uncomfortable kind of aspect, and something that I think authors need to be maybe a little bit more aware of when they're writing love scenes. Of course, like for war veterans and things like that, when they're reading a violent battle scene, it would be good for authors to have done maybe some research and make sure they're not saying anything insensitive about violence or post-traumatic stress from like
Mm.
battle situation. So there is still sort of a comparison there, but yeah, kind of as you said, I think it's more authors might have to be a little more careful when it comes to the love scenes. Yeah.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
no, you brought up a really good point about battle scenes that I didn't think of when I said that. So I really appreciate that, because I think you're right. It's very easy to glamorize war
Mhm.
and and also to create a very simplistic view of PTSD. So, and not to add a lot of depth to that topic, just have it there almost like, just to kind of showcase it. And so I think that that's a really good point.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm so that's kind of some heavier stuff we were talking about there. But maybe to go back a little bit to how things have changed on booktube. I am curious. I know, like, I guess when you began, or at least a lot of the videos that I first watched of you were videos about Malazan, discussions that you were having with other content creators. So that was, I guess, that was your involvement with one fan community and one kind of fandom. And now I'm really enjoying your more recent A Song of Ice and Fire reread experience and the videos that you're making about that. I am curious a little bit if you've noticed a lot, like a big difference in the types of discussions had on, say, something like Malazan versus Song of Ice and Fire. I guess if the YouTuber or booktuber experience changes based on which
Oh,
series.
that's a
If
really good point. Well, I can say that with Malazan, the whole entire ways of approaching Malazan discussions has changed dramatically, I think, since 2021 on YouTube.
uh,
And in some ways, that's been a bit of a challenge to watch because I feel like it's becoming more popular, and that's a good thing. And we want more people to get involved in the series and not be intimidated by it, of course, because it's such great literature. And
right.
I'm very hesitant to recommend it to everyone. I'm always very careful about that because I think, of course, I'm actually pretty careful about everything I read, everything I love, recommending anything I love, but particularly with that series because it is so different. Again, it goes so much against many of the familiar fantasy conventions and might throw the reader off if they're not prepared for that. It threw me off when I went into the series. And there is a lot of heavy content in that series too, for people who have gone through trauma, speaking of trauma. So I am seeing a lot of people interested in the series, wanting to get into this series, but I'm also hearing a lot of people drop off because it's different than what they were expecting.
Yeah.
And I think some of the ways that they compare it to other series or the discussions I've heard or criticisms have been a little challenging for me, that I've tried to kind of step back from that a little bit, and just accept different people are going to have different experiences, of course. But just, I think also some of the discussion that I've heard revolving that series has been like, in order to have the best experience of this series, you need to be listening to this podcast and you need to have the PowerPoint slides, which I've never seen these PowerPoint slides I keep hearing about. And you need to be checking out the Wikipedia and you need to be checking out the Tor chapter by chapter breakdown things. And honestly, when I read the series, I don't know, but I'd love to hear your experience with that. But when I read the series, I did actually in books 3, I think at the end of book 3 and into book 4, I did listen to the 10 Very Big Books podcast and I really enjoyed it. However, I stopped listening to it after that because I just found it was taking me so much time to get through this series that it felt too much extra stuff to do. I just wanted to read it and process it on my own. And so that's what I did. And every now and then I got curious about something. And so I would look up, what this character would look like or remind myself who this character was. But I never felt like I had to do that or that my enjoyment weighed specifically on this, And so I say if those things call to the reader, go for it. Do it if it inspires you, if it adds to your experience, but don't feel like you have to do it, because I see some readers who are going through the series and they're hearing all this advice coming at them of how they have to read the series. And then they feel like, oh no, I can't enjoy this series if I don't do X, Y, and Z, when there have been people who've been huge fans of this series for many years before that stuff was even created.
Since 2000, yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that's been an ongoing conversation I've been watching evolve on BookTube with that series specifically. I don't know, that probably didn't answer your question, but did you want to ask me further about that? Sorry.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I started I think, well, so my brother got into the Game of Thrones show, watched or started watching, then said, no, I have to read the books before continuing on. And so he'd read a book, watch the corresponding season, and only 3 seasons were out. And I was really into science fiction at that time. And so I was reading a lot of like Orson Scott Card, Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, that type of stuff. And my brother he said, okay, just sit down and watch at least the first season of Game of Thrones. And we watched it in the night and I loved it.
Mm.
And this was right before we both went off to like different universities. And so I brought the 5 books with me and I read the books or yeah, those 5 books. Loved it. And I asked him what else was good fantasy out there, if he knew anything else he'd recommend. And he said he wasn't sure, but a friend of his in college said that he should either try Wheel of Time or Malazan,
Mm.
which I mean now it's sort of strange to recommend those 2 series in the same breath. But yeah, so my brother was trying to start Malazan and he was kind of pausing a little bit on Gardens of the Moon. He only got it like a part way through. He recommended it to me, and so I started, and this would have been 2015, I want to say. Yeah, 2015. And back then, I read the series 2015 to 2017, so it took me a couple years. There was no real Malazan content on YouTube. And yeah, and I mean, I think by the end of when I was reading this series, there was one podcast sort of channel, and I apologies to these guys if they're still on the platform and still watching stuff. But I think their names are Duncan and Momo or something like that,
Hmm.
and they might have been Bulgarian, I want to say. And they were doing a reread of the series, and it was really, I think, the only stuff I saw where I could finally kind of hear what other people had to say about the series. And I had already kind of gone through it already. So yeah, you definitely, if anyone's watching this and you're thinking about starting Malazan, you don't need the kind of other homework or the other podcasts and things. Now, they can be useful tools if you're curious, but it's definitely not. It's not a series where you need that stuff to enjoy it.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
glad that stuff exists. I think it's
right. Yeah,
wonderful that people took the time to develop that. And
yeah,
if it adds to people's experience, and if maybe they feel like they need it and they enjoy the experience more because of it, that's great. But it's just the obligation message that you can't enjoy it unless. And then people
right.
feel like they have to do extra homework on top
Yeah,
of reading a very dense series. That's where I feel like, I don't know about that.
yeah. Yeah, and yeah, so like I guess even my love of your channel and Jimmy's channel, a lot of that came from or in Brittany also at like was at that same time. You're probably the 3 main ones. I guess Mike's book reviews, but he started a little earlier and kind of dropped or he's on hit pause on the series for now.
Mhm.
Um all of that, my experience getting into all of your channels was, oh, I can't wait until they get to this part. So I can't speak to what it might be like for a new reader who's going to watch your discussion that you had once they like get to that, but once they get kind of caught up. I'm sure that's a really rewarding and fun experience too. But yeah, it was always, oh, I'm wondering what they're gonna think about going somewhere else in Midnight Tides. Like that sort of thing was always my biggest draw
Oh, that's
to
my favorite
all of
thing
your content.
too.
Yeah,
Even now, I get so excited watching people's journey through the series. And
yeah,
sometimes it's disappointing. Like some people just they don't click with it, and then you just have to be like, okay, I get it.
yeah,
But then some people they really love it, and you see the excitement they feel when they get to the end of Memories of Ice, or they get to Midnight Tides and they experience that whole thing, or they meet, and they meet Jehol and Buck, or they read
mhm,
the Bone Hunters and
yeah,
everything. It's just there are so many exciting things it's just so exciting to watch people's journey through the series. I never get tired of it.
yeah. Right now, I'm loving Murphy
Yes.
Neighbor's journey through the series. It seems like she's really enjoying it. I'm also enjoying Tall Guy Reads, and I'm not sure the what the group exactly is that's doing that read along there, but I really enjoy their discussions. Yeah.
Yes, actually, that's funny you said that because those were the two people that immediately came to mind.
Okay.
Murphy, and I actually predicted Murphy would love Midnight Tide specifically,
Yeah.
and I was right. And she seems to be really enjoying the Bone Hunters. And then
Mhm.
same with Tall Guy Reed, same with Alex. He was one that I predicted that would love the series. I told him that before he started, and it's just been a joy to watch him, to watch his reactions to it. And yeah, the other people with him in that particular read along include Jordan Reed
Okay, right,
and
right.
I'm trying to remember who else, because I know there was another person who dropped out, or a couple people
Right.
who might have dropped out. So yeah,
Okay.
that's the main ones I remember.
And yeah, it's such a massive series that deals with so many different things, and like it is hard to recommend because so I brief anecdote, a former professor of mine, he's kind of getting into writing fantasy. And so he asked if I had recommendations for him. And whenever anyone asks me for recommendations, I want to make sure I mention Stephen Erickson and Malazan, but that often comes with a few disclaimers, typically the length of the series, how maybe confusing some of the like the earliest book might be, or the first book might be to some readers. And this former professor of mine, he specifically was curious if I knew of fantasy books that deal with like a secret police institution or like police abusing their powers. And immediately one particular plotline in one of the Malazan books jumped to mind. And I don't necessarily want to spoil things for anyone, but do you know which storyline I'm thinking of?
Which
The
book?
the seventh book.
That's what I was thinking.
Okay,
Yes.
yeah, yeah.
That was the one I
And
was thinking.
so
Yeah.
I had to say, oh, if you want that, Malazan has a great
Yeah.
storyline about that, but it's in the seventh book, and all of these books are a little longer, and so hopefully you'd enjoy the other ones getting to that point. But yeah, I think that can be one of the biggest hurdles in recommending the series to readers, and when readers like drop out early on because they may not have gotten to those elements of the series that people are hoping that they or are thinking that they would really enjoy. And obviously, we don't want to force anyone to read through anything that they don't want to read through to get to what we think they'll enjoy. But yes,
Oh,
so
yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. I feel like that could be a whole discussion, like how to sell Malazan to people. I have people ask me that all the time
yeah,
on live shows, like, okay, sell Malazan to me. Why should I read Malazan Book of the Fallen?
yeah.
And I'm like, this is going to be a long conversation.
Right, right.
There's a lot of factors to consider. And I think like a simple way I like to put it is, if you're somebody who loves the Stormlight Archive, have you read any of the Stormlight Archive books by Brandon Sanderson?
I've read Mistborn Era 1, Elantris, and Warbreaker.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
yeah, and a
Yeah.
couple of the short things, but yeah. So, and I've kind of put my Cosmere stuff on hold right now, just focusing on
Mhm.
there's not a ton of romance in the Cosmere.
And you're probably not going to be, you're probably not going to love the romance that is in there.
Oh,
Just
okay, okay,
FYI.
okay.
It's not my favorite feature of Sanderson's writing, but I have to
Okay.
say, I have to mention Stormlight only because I feel like so much of what Malazan does feels almost like the antithesis of Brandon
Oh, okay,
Sanderson's writing, meaning
okay.
the prose style. Brandon Sanderson writes in what he describes as like window glass pane prose. I mean, there's still a style to it,
Yeah.
but you know, it's made to be very straightforward. The themes are very overt, on the nose. I mean, it's written in such a way that you understand everything that's happening. With Malazan, the themes, I wouldn't say they're totally hidden by any
Yeah.
means.
No, no.
They're very, I think they're prominent, but at the same time, I think that they're not being told to you in the way that they are in Sanderson's books.
Mhm.
And I would say, like, and I'm just specifically thinking of one scene in the first book of the Stormlight Archive. But anyway, yeah, I think that the approach to theme is different, the prose style is different, and the focus, because I think that when you read a Sanderson book, you're following very specific characters. You know who the good guys are, who the bad guys are. You have a very specific plot format. And the other thing with Sanderson's books, and this is the big thing too, every Stormlight book, and the reason I bring up that series specifically is because he follows the same exact structure for every Stormlight book.
Okay.
Meaning, well, there's maybe a tiny bit of variation, but for the most part, every single book, at least so far published, has a prologue, and he does do interesting things with the prologues in that book. But he also has these interludes that kind of give you places in the world to understand, and he also gives you like one particular character perspective that you're flashing back to And it's been a long time since I've read Stormlight. So if I'm not saying that in the most accurate way, I apologize. But for the most part, I think it's a very structured series, like the same format, the same kind of structure, even what they call the Sanderlanche, which is, I know, not unique to Sanderson, but the way that he builds the climax and brings out certain hidden plot points at the end. He does everything in a very, I think, Sanderson fashion. Whereas with Erickson, every book in the Malazan, I think, series, as far as I could tell, the structure is very different from book to book. The storylines are different. You're following a lot of different characters, but you don't have one main hero or group of characters you're following. There could be some argument about that. Yeah. But it's just the difference in the difference in prose style. You get a lot of variation in the prose, and you get a lot of subtext and metaphor to unpack. So I think it's just a very different approach to reading fantasy. And not saying that Sanderson or Stormlight is wrong or inferior. I think it just depends on what you're going for and your taste is. But I think if you're using that as a measure of this is what fantasy should be, then you have to be willing to open up your mind a bit, I would say, when you read Malazan.
Okay, yeah. I like that a lot. I'm curious, with Malazan in particular, are you intrigued more or less by some of the other series outside of Erickson's Malazan Book of the Fallen, or have you started on any of the like prequel series, sequel series, any of the novellas or anything like that?
Oh no, like I told you, you are far more well read with Malazan books than I am. So the first year that I had a booktube channel, I mostly just focused on finishing the 10 books, and that was a lot of time and energy. I watch other booktubers now, by the way, and I'm like, how are they able to read a Malazan book and 6 other books in 1 month? Like, how do they do it? It took me like the whole month of December in 2021 to read The Crippled God.
Yeah,
I didn't read anything else. But yeah, so it does take me quite a bit of time to get through those books personally. I did read the first book in the Witness trilogy. So I read The God Is Not Willing. And what else have I read? I read Knight of Knives by Ian C.S. Lamont. And so that's about it.
Okay. Are there any of those series that you're more or less inclined to pick up, like going forward, or any that just don't interest you?
Yes, I will certainly read the next Witness book now that I've started that trilogy when it comes out. As far as the novels of the Malazan Empire, I suppose the next one I need to read is Return of the Crimson Guard.
Yes.
And I'm very I think I'm a little nervous about that one because I have heard some varying thoughts about it. And I do kind of know what happens at the end. I was slightly spoiled. So I will get to it eventually and just try to have an open mind, of course. And so have you read that?
Yeah, so I think with Return of the Crimson Guard in particular, my biggest problem with reading that book, or my, I guess, reception of it, why it might not have clicked so well with me, was I read it between Reaper's Gale and Toll the Hounds of Erickson's Book of the Fallen series. And those are easily my 2 favorite of all of Book of the Fallen. And so kind of jumping back to jumping over to a different style, a different cast of characters, regardless of how well written or constructed Return of the Crimson Guard may be, I think I really kind of did that book and Esselmont a disservice by sandwiching it in between 2 of my like favorite books of all time. So yeah, it's hard for me to. I think it's a great book, and I think since you've read Book of the Fallen, and since you're not like inundated with a ton of other Malazan content right now, or it doesn't seem like you have a ton on your TBR right now, if you do jump into Return of the Crimson Guard, I predict that a lot of it will be like a nice, like, oh, I remember these races, I remember these types of these locations and these characters. So there will be probably, I can predict it being a much more exciting read going to read it after after a bit of a break, unlike how I read it the first time. Yeah, and I mean now there's so many. I'd say that's probably the busiest of Esselmont's books as far as number of storylines going on, number of characters you have to keep track of, and a lot of them are kind of referenced, or you get earlier versions of them in Esselmont's prequels. So that's probably the one that when I go back to reread his novels of the Malazan Empire, having read his prequels will help the most with that one. Um, yeah, I don't. I hope that kind of answers
Yes.
how I
So
feel
are
about
those
it.
paths to ascendancy? Those ones?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
And I love the Path to Ascendancy books. Dancer's Lament, the first one, and then Forge of the High Mage, the fourth one. Those are my favorite of those four. And I mean, it's the first three are path singular to ascendancy, and then
Mhm.
now these next three are going to be paths with an S to ascendancy. So it's still the same series, but with just that slight edit on the series title. But they're
Mm.
very, very good. I think. Yeah, I of course highly recommend all things Malazan to anyone. I think I'm curious what your favorite Malazan books are.
Sure. I've always said that I'd have the hardest time ranking them because I think ah, they're all so powerful.
Mhm.
My favorite is The Crippled God.
Okay.
That one, it just made me so emotional, so emotional. So I have a very unpopular opinion, which is that I really loved Gardens of the Moon.
Okay.
And I did not read that because of booktube. I read that because my husband picked up a used copy at a bookstore and because he had read one of those 100 best books of all time or best fantasy books of all time list, and it was near the top. So he picked it up intending to read it. And then I ended up reading it. I think he read it alongside me, actually. He read the ebook version though. And so I I was very new to getting back into adult fantasy at the time because, like I said, I was reading a lot of YA fantasy for a short while and some Sanderson too. And I enjoyed my Sanderson journey. I should just go ahead and mention,
Uh,
but I was immediately hooked. There was something about Gardens of the Moon that made me feel, for the first time in a very long time, like I was getting something that I needed out of fantasy that I didn't even know I needed. It was something about the tone, the atmosphere, even the quirkiness of the characters, the settings, the wild magic, and the female characters too. I think that we get some wonderful female characters for adult fantasy in that particular book, especially. So, like Tattersail, of course, that was a huge sell for me. I loved it. I even loved Tattersail and Piran and their storyline.
yes. Yeah.
I won't say
Yeah.
more than that, but I loved that. I loved all of it. And I was just surprised to the point where I knew that there were a lot of things I wasn't totally understanding. That's probably true for me in every Malazan book. There are still a lot
Me
that I
too.
don't understand. But I did finish the book. And I tabbed the heck out of my book, I should say. I finished the book, and this was one of the first books I've ever read, or maybe the first book I've ever read, where I finished the book and I wanted to go back to the first page and start it all over again.
Yeah.
That's how much I loved it. And I actually looked back, and this was my experience with a lot of the Malazan books. I'm a tabber. I tab the heck out of my books. It's what I do. And I do that because there will be things that catch my eye that I think I want to look back at later. But the other thing too is that when I got to the thing that I appreciate about every Malazan book that I read is that anytime I've gone back to previous tabs that I've made along the way, I've gone back to those sections and I suddenly have had like new context for what I've read in those sections. Like, oh, wow, this makes a whole new sense based on what happens later in the book. And so I've always loved that journey reading a Malazan book, just seeing how things make more sense, how he doesn't give everything to you right away. But then when you get to the end, you look back and you understand it in a new way. And so I just have always thought that was brilliant about Erickson's writing. But when I finished The Crippled God, it was very much a similar experience to Gardens of the Moon. It wasn't so much that I wanted to go back to the beginning of The Crippled God. It was more that I want to go back to the beginning of Gardens of the Moon and start all over again.
Yeah. Oh,
I
yeah.
was just, I felt like I was floating. Like it was so inspiring for me. And I started watching videos of other people who had read the series and saw the emotion that would fill them after finishing the series. And I was like, I understand. I get
Uh-huh.
it.
Yeah.
It just takes you right into your heart. And so that's what I look for in a good book is I want to connect not only to my mind and to be curious about things and wonder about things. That's very important to me. It's why I read fantasy. But when a fantasy book can give me that experience, but also take me into my heart, you've just won a fan. I love that. So that's been a powerful experience reading his books.
Are there any other books that you've read since then, or even before then, I guess, that have given you a similar experience?
Not quite on, see, it's a challenge to answer that question because I think I can say that maybe the closest I can come to is Lord of the Rings.
Oh,
Now,
okay.
my Lord of the Rings journey was a little bit weird though, because I started the books when I was a teenager and I fell in love with, I read The Hobbit and then I read The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and I started Return of the King and I famously didn't finish. And then I kept trying to go back to it and I felt like every time I went back to it, like I'd need to start all the way from the beginning. So I kept on trying to restart The Lord of the Rings and then never finishing. I was really bad at that time in my life. I just DNF'd like crazy. I rarely ever DNF now, but back then I did it all too often. But I still will never forget how those books felt the first time. And even then, just being able to pick out any sentence that Tolkien wrote and having such a deep love and appreciation for the way he crafted a single sentence. I just remember that feeling as a teenager. But then I did finish The Lord of the Rings, actually in the middle of my Malazan journey.
Okay.
And I was so blown away by the end. I cried so hard and was so moved. And I remember knowing, Philip's video that he did about his top 10 fantasy series and about how Lord of the Rings, what was it? He said something along the lines of like he it brought him into his soul and then Malazan set him free, something
Okay.
like that.
Okay.
I'm paraphrasing. I should know it. It's been quoted so many times at this point. But I felt that way with Lord of the Rings. I was so moved by that ending that I was even wondering like how can any series top this? How can Malazan possibly top this? But it does. And I think it does in part too because you spend a lot more time in the world. So I feel like it has a bigger gravity to it when you do get to the ending. So that's definitely been one. A Song of Ice and Fire also, just even though it's an unfinished series, it will still be one of my favorite series of all time. I don't care. I don't care if it's never finished. I don't
Yeah.
care if Martin does come out with Winds of Winter and it tanks. It had a similar effect on me. I did read that a little over a decade ago before the show came out, right before the show came out, or right when the show came out. I don't remember which order, but I did read all 5 books before even watching season 2, I think.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
so I was also just completely blown away with that world and that experience. Again, similar in that it just gives me something that I didn't know I needed or wanted. That's the best way I could describe certain fantasy I love. Since then, other fandoms, I did get into a Sanderson. I went through a Sanderson phase. I'm on a Sanderson break right now, but I did enjoy my time reading Sanderson. I never quite got that feeling that I did from those other series I mentioned. And I'm currently reading The Long Price Quartet by Daniel Abraham,
Okay.
and I'm just adoring it so much. Oh, I cannot stop gushing about that. So, yeah, those are
Okay.
long answer to your question. I'm sorry.
No, great. I didn't know that. That was great. Yeah. I wonder maybe I have a theory Alan is paying other booktubers to sell the long price quartet.
Well, the thing with
I'm
the
just
Long
kidding.
Price Quartet, okay, so a couple things with that. Yes, I do owe a lot to Alan about this, but here's the thing. I saw the Long Price Quartet in a Barnes and Noble before I even knew about BookTube. Actually, it was when
Okay.
I first found out about BookTube. I hadn't found his channel. It was years before finding his channel. I saw it in the bookstore and I almost bought it like 2 or 3 times. I'd pick it up and then I got nervous and put it back because of the high price of the book and price. That's kind of ironic or kind of funny. No pun intended.
Long,
And
the long
and
high price quartet.
and so I just like I ended up putting it back because I just wasn't sure. I was scared because I didn't know anything. I didn't know enough about it, but there was something about it that I kept gravitating towards. And then I didn't end up buying it. Guess what I ended up buying? I ended up buying Mistborn because I did hear about it on booktube. I heard people like Mistborn, blah blah blah. Oh my
Right,
gosh,
right.
Long Price Quartet is far and above Mistborn for me, at
Okay.
least right now. But I did pick up Mistborn. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the Mistborn trilogy, but then years later, when I found out about Alan's channel and I started to see him gushing about the Long Price Quartet, I was like, oh my gosh, that's the book that I almost picked up so many times.
Uh-huh.
So I went back and it was no longer there. And then you couldn't find it anywhere forever, at least not the bind up. I did find out eventually they do have 2 omnibus editions that you can get now, but they no longer sell that bind up. It's out of print. So my dear friend Evie gifted it to me. And then at that point, when she gifted it
Nice.
to me, I I already had so many books like I was trying to get through, including Malazan, I think at the
Uh-huh.
time. I'm not sure. I know I was booked up. So it took a long time to get to it. But yes, Alan is definitely, I owe it to Alan. I do. And I blame him because I think he's the reason that those books were no longer on the shelves
Oh,
for a
right,
while there.
right.
And I don't know that I would have returned to it, honestly, after seeing it in the bookstore those many years ago, if not for Alan's praise of it. But man, he did not steer me wrong with that recommendation. Cannot speak enough praises about it right now.
Okay, yeah, I do know every time I'm in the bookstore and I see either that series or if I see what is it, Josiah Bancroft's Sunlit in a Sentence books. The
Mhm.
first I immediately think Alan would probably want me to get those.
Yes.
And I'm sure they're very good. From what I've heard and what I've watched of his videos, I'm intrigued to pick those up at some point. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I have much room in my TBR at least until 2025 or so. But yeah, yeah. Who knows? I might just on a whim pick those up and read them. Who knows?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I'm curious. I know you and some other of my favorite booktubers have started Janny Wurts her Wars of Light and Shadow series. I'm pretty new to it as well. I'm only 3 books in, and I'm curious if you have any hopes that that might be a series that gets on that same level as Malazan and Lord of the Rings and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah. I really enjoyed what I've read of Worth so far. So I do have a discussion coming out soon with a Critical Dragon and Philip Chase on Ships of Merrier. We're doing a little read along together. And I know that AP can't have been a Critical Dragon. He revealed he's further along than we are. I think he's on book
Okay.
4. So with that particular series, yeah, I'm really loving it. I I'm trying to think of what to say. So I found out about Janny Wurts through ICFA. I think you went to ICFA this last year. Am I not
I
mistaken?
did, yeah. That was
Yeah.
an amazing experience, yeah.
Oh, fantastic. So
Yeah.
I'm sure you got to meet her in person.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I
Yeah.
met her and met Erickson and Donaldson, and I felt bad about meeting Stephen R. Donaldson because I haven't read anything by him yet.
Oh, same
Uh,
here.
but yeah,
Yes.
but meeting him, and I don't know, he was such a nice guy, and so I've got him on my shelf right there, so
Oh, yes.
I'll read him soon
I
enough.
it's funny how I met him too, because I went to ICFA the year before and
Okay.
I just missed Janny. I just missed getting to meet her. She had just
Oh,
left the day before. But Philip had shown me to the bookstore there. And of course, there's wonderful deals on books in that bookstore.
oh yeah.
So, so I saw a signed version of To Ride Hell's Chasm, and I immediately knew that was the book, the one book I bought actually out of the whole bookstore. And I was so excited. And so I bought the book. And then the funny thing was we went outside and we were all hanging out and talking. I put the book down on a table, and then this person comes up, this man comes up and picks up the book and starts looking at it. And then AP says, Johanna, that's Stephen Donaldson. I was like, oh my goodness. So he was like looking at my book, and I was like, hello, my name is Johanna. And he says, I've read this book before. And
Yeah.
so that was actually how I met Stephen Donaldson. but I met Steven Erikson there as well. So yes, I then ended up reading it alongside Philip and a couple of other people. And so I read the book and I really was surprised how much I loved it. It took me a while, and I have been transparent about that. With just about every single one of Janny Wurts' books, I've had to adjust because her style, it's amazing. She has an
Right.
incredibly gifted style with her prose, but it is a very it's a style that for me personally takes an adjustment.
Mhm.
It's one that's it's very what's the way I could describe her style? How would you describe her style? Actually, maybe I should ask you.
I hmm
It's
I would
very
describe it.
flowy and
Yeah,
lyrical.
it's there's almost a dreamlike aspect to, or it's
Hmm,
like a
that's a good
I
way to
don't know.
put it.
It's almost like you're looking through a foggy like crystal ball at these events that were happening in the past, and it's scene to scene. That's kind of how I feel when I read it sometimes, and to the point where I'll just get caught up in the flow and the kind of rhythm of it, and
Ah,
realize,
yes.
oh shoot, I have to go back a couple pages because I think I know the character that is speaking right now, but I need to double check that I know who's all in this room right now just to make sure I didn't miss something. That's
Ah,
probably what my experience is mostly like with her. I don't know if that sounds similar to
that's
you.
really, yeah, I love the way you put that. And I love the way they use the word rhythmic. So I just recently I showed my mom, I was talking about this the Ships of Merrier video too. I showed my mom a chapter, I think the beginning of chapter 7 in Ships of Merrier. I think that was the chapter. I showed her the beginning of it and had her read it. And my mother, I call her a prose snob in the best, most loving way. I always love to learn from my mother. She did not have enough superlatives to talk about how much she loved
Oh,
Janny's prose.
right.
Like
Yeah.
she said it's lilting, alive, rhythmic. Rhythmic was definitely a word that came up for her. She said it was musical. And as soon as I told her she's a painter, no surprise, of course. And same here. Once I realized she was the one who painted her covers, I
Uh,
was not surprised. So what I've said about her prose is that for me, I did a video on my channel um, about a year ago called Are You a Visual Reader? And so it's about visual, like whether people are able to visualize what they read or not. Because
mhm.
I've been surprised how many of my friends on BookTube do not visualize what they read. Now, I am somebody who very much visualizes what I read, but it's also something I can kind of turn on and off. And what I've noticed is that with Janny's prose specifically, if I read her prose with an analytical prefrontal cortex activated kind of mindset, I really struggle with it for some reason. But
Uh,
if I sort of flip on the visual center of my brain and I try to just cue in to what she's visually presenting through the words, suddenly the picture unfolds and I fall into a flow with the story. So
uh,
it always takes me, I think, some adjusting. Another thing I think that, yeah, so I mean, I could go on about that, but I'll just keep it short for that. But yes, I do love her writing. I think that it always takes me an adjustment, like I said. To write Hell's Chasm, though, I did not know if I could get into it at first. And then after I got to a page 100, it transformed into one of my favorite standalones in fantasy. So I was a huge fan. And we were talking about romance earlier,
yeah.
not to give away too much with the prequel novella in of the series or stuff that happens in the series, but I have to say I think Janny Wurts' romance is some of my favorite that I've ever read in
Yeah.
fantasy.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I can definitely I haven't read the Gallant prequel but I really like the uh elements of the sort of romantic tension that is present in the main series. I really enjoyed that so much so that I I feel sad when we go so long without seeing certain characters because I'm
Same.
curious what they're thinking about a situation. But yeah, I just finished the third book in Wars of Light and Shadow, and I loved I loved every second
Oh,
of both book two and book three. Although, do you have the edition that is like it combines both book 2 and book 3. Okay, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I have the edition that combines them. So in my discussion with a Critical Dragon and Philip, we just discussed the first half of that. So just Ships of Barrier. But yeah, I think she's incredibly gifted. I think that her style, it really supports the world building. Like I think that she creates a lot of, I don't know, ethereal is the word that comes to mind when I think
Okay,
of
yeah.
Janny's writing, prismatic, colorful. There's obviously a lot of play on light and frequency and music. And she
Mhm.
brings music to life through her prose too. So I think she's very gifted in that regard.
Yeah, I think the certain musical scenes in which one of the characters is playing are easily some of the most emotional or some of the most powerful.
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
Mhm.
Is there are there other series or anything else you're reading right now that maybe we haven't talked about that much, or maybe you just haven't had the chance, or it hasn't fit into your plans to speak about on your channel that you'd like to mention?
Oh, well, I know on my channel, I just finished the first Law series, and so I did a video about that.
Okay.
Um, so I'm a huge fan of Joe Abercrombie. I love the first Law books. I've been getting into a lot of darker fantasy and darker books this last year. So I've started getting into McCarthy, which is not a
Yeah. Oh,
fantasy
that's right.
writer,
That's right.
but Cormac McCarthy, and that's largely thanks to Jimmy, honestly. I've also gotten into Baker a little bit, also thanks partly to Jimmy too. But I did read the Prince of Nothing trilogy, and I'm hoping to read Aspect Emperor, which is the ongoing part of that series. They're the second series in that world. And I just started Guy Gavriel Kay.
Okay. Okay.
Have you read any Guy Gavriel Kay?
I have not. He's on my list. Um I have that book and Tagana and Song
Oh,
for a
yes, yes.
Bone. I
Mhm.
have those, and I think I'll probably read them in publication order, even though I have heard some people say either Lions of Elmerson or Song for a Bone are the best places to start.
Mhm.
I might still start with Tagana because everything I've heard, I feel like it's a shoo-in that I'll like those.
Yes.
I love his, I mean, I studied history in school and I love fantasy, so I just love things that kind of merge the two, and everything I've heard about the time periods that Kay sort of adapts, I guess, is what he
Mhm.
does, and then retells. I'm really excited. Will that be your first Guy Gabriel Kay,
It
or
will be, yes,
okay,
because my friend Jacob, who's a big Guy Gavriel Kay fan and has a whole Guy Gavriel Kay, he has a whole Guy Gavriel Kay guide on his channel, Jake Bishop. He
okay,
recommends
yeah,
starting with this one.
okay,
And so I'm taking his advice to heart. He says, everybody starts with Tigana, start with this one. I know that Jimmy just read Tigana and was not a big fan.
okay, okay,
He said it was his least favorite. This
okay,
was
and
his, yeah, he
because I
did.
know he loves Song for a Bone,
Yes.
so okay.
Yeah, he recommended that to me. So I actually have that on my shelf too. But I am starting with this one and I love it so far. I
Okay,
love it. I know he's also known for his sex scenes. I haven't gotten to an actual sex scene yet, but
right. I'll be
this is an author who
curious.
doesn't shy away from it. That's what I've heard. So, but yes, I love the characters and the character interactions so far. And this one is supposed to be evocative of medieval Spain, and I definitely think that's the case, even with some of the names. Like there's a character named Rodrigo and Gonzalez, so like
Okay.
Spanish names.
Yeah.
And the land here is called Esperania.
Oh,
So
okay.
it sounds like almost like España, or sounds almost Spanish.
Right, right.
But I'm really enjoying the way he's building these different cultures. I'm getting ideas of where he's drawing inspiration, like real world history inspiration for some of the cultures too. So I'm just loving it so far, loving it. So I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts if you do pick up Kay.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I did a video with Philip a little bit ago. It's on his channel, or it will be on his channel. I don't think it's up yet. And we were talking, the romance kind of thing came up a little bit, and he brought up the interesting point of how sex scenes are read and interpreted depending on the gender of the author themselves, and how like I've heard people be a little bit more critical of, say, Guy Gabriel Kay's sex scenes than Diana Gabaldon's sex scenes. So I'm not sure if that comes down to one being a man, one
Oh,
being a woman, or if it's just specifically their style with writing those scenes, regardless of their gender.
I'd be
Uh,
really curious about that because do you know of any male authors who write good sex scenes in your opinion? Is that okay to ask?
yeah, I don't think I really know. I can't think of any off the top of my head. Yeah, no, none really come to mind. I'm looking at my shelf.
I know, I'm
Uh,
trying to think too. I can't think of any that come to mind.
I mean, I will say, I don't know if you've read Wheel of Time.
Mm-mm.
There aren't ex super descriptive or like explicit sex scenes in that, but there is romance. But there's other things about those sex scenes that makes them strange. Um, well, anyone who's read Wheel of Time watching, I hope you know what I mean. By I don't know, just with people's minds. I I won't spoil anything. But yeah, so that's a male author writing sex scenes that didn't really work for me. Again, I think that was more to do with just other things happening with the plot, like the other circumstances of what's going on during those scenes. That isn't strictly, I don't know. Yeah, I don't
That-
need to get too into that,
That's a
but
really good point, though. That's a really good point about reader interpretation based on the gender of the author.
right,
Because honestly, I mean, I don't know. Um, just don't know. I don't remember like overt sex in the romantic scenes that Janny Wurts has written, but
right, right,
I loved the way she handled the romance element and the tension
right.
and the intimacy between characters of what I've read in her books so far. And I read Mercedes Lackey for the first time this year. Do you know who that is?
I know the name. I haven't read her, but yeah, that's good. Or
Yeah, I read her the Arrows trilogy is
okay,
what I read. I binged it. It's one of those that kind of like Sarah J. Maas, I think it borders on like new adult
yeah,
rather. I would categorize it probably in that area because I feel like books 2 and 3 felt to me like more conventional of what I'd see in young adult in a way, but at the same time, there is some triggering content, especially in book 3. There are some pretty violent scenes that I'm not sure would make it young adult, and I actually loved it,
okay,
but it is more focused on it does focus quite a bit on sex at times and romance, and it didn't bother me, which is kind of surprising because one thing that I do find a little challenging for me to read when it comes to sex scenes personally is when the characters are young. It's something
yeah,
I really don't like. But I think in like her case, for some reason, it didn't bother me. I don't know if I aged up the characters in my head. I sometimes do that. I'll just age them up in my head and then it
yeah,
won't bother me as much. But I don't particularly like that. But I felt like she did it in a way that didn't bother me. And I also appreciated that in her particular books, they were written in the 80s, I think, that series, and you have great representation. Like you have same-sex relationships, it's
okay.
normalized in the world. And I would say even like some critical looks at patriarchy and polygamy when it's like a more male-dominated patriarchal polygamy. So I enjoyed them quite a bit. I thought they were fun.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure I have too many more specific questions for you. Is there anything else that you were hoping to speak about today, or
I'm trying to think if I have anything in particular. Uh, Not that I can think of. It's just been really cool to hear about your Malazan journey. And where are you in the series right now? Like, are you all caught up? Have you read all the books then?
yes, all caught up. I will say there are sections of like Esselmont's first series, his novels of the Malazan Empire, and also sections of Erickson's Valkyrie and Corporal Brooch novellas that I read probably when I was like just in the middle of other series, so I don't remember certain things from those series as well as I should. So that I really do need to go back and revisit some of those books. But yeah, I've read everything that's been published. That doesn't mean I retained all of it. I mean, that said, Malazan Book of the Fallen, I constantly go back through, even not necessarily doing like a reread, but going back through, looking at certain scenes and like trying to analyze that and just revisiting stuff. So that's all been, kind of kept pretty fresh in my mind. Carcanis, I absolutely love. I think if I did a ranking, that would average out to be my favorite two books, even though they'd maybe rank like fourth and fifth or so. Still, the average would bring or make them the best. And yeah, I highly recommend Carcanis to any Malazan fans. I would say to anyone, it could be a little strange starting with those, because they are, I mean, they're pretty dense. But yeah, yeah, and also thank you for talking about your Malazan experience and your experience talking about Malazan on BookTube and what the series has meant for you.
Sure. Yeah, no, happy to talk about it anytime. So thanks for having me.
Yeah. I also wanted to mention I really love your Why Read series, or
Oh,
what
thanks.
why do you read series. And
Mhm.
yeah, I just I noticed like that, or you started that, then Philip started Dear Dr. Fantasy, and Jimmy's been doing his chatting with nuts thing. I think that's a really cool, I don't know, cool community building kind of, or community engagement sort of exercise that you all do. And I just wanted to say thank you for bringing all those booktubers together to chat about those things. Those are always a ton of fun to watch. I've
Oh,
like
thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I've got like an hour 15-minute commute to and from work every day. So sometimes I'll put those on and just listen to you all talk. And
Aw, thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, that those have been a joy to have. I'm hoping to have a video on my channel sometime in the not so distant future on why I created Why Read. So
Okay,
people can keep a lookout for that. I hope to get that together.
okay, okay.
But it's been a pleasure. It's always wonderful to talk with other creators. So yeah.
Well, yeah, again, I don't think I have too much more to talk your ear off about. But yeah, just thank you so much for coming on here today. And yeah, I think that should do it.
All right. Thank you. All right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.